Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in Simeon's wake. Supplemental: The Missing Meeting, Philo and Jesus. Today's supplemental episode is going to be something of an experiment. It's really not so much a proper episode, even a proper supplemental, as it is a chance for me to express my outrage and shock that someone is wrong on the internet. To make a long story short, while doing research for the main episode, I found an argument that made me really mad, and I want to tell you about it and hopefully wring a little bit of insight and found poetry out of it before the end. So, here we go. Last episode, I mentioned that Philo and Jesus never interacted with each other as far as we know. There is nothing to indicate that Philo even knew who Jesus was. Now, this fact has been taken up by a peculiar group of people, the Jesus mythicists. These people hold the view that Jesus of Nazareth never actually existed. For them, Jesus is a fictional creation of the early church, fused together from bits and pieces of different mythologies of the day. You can find these people lurking in particularly desolate and fetid corners of the internet, yelling about all the evidence that they have found that nobody will pay attention to. One piece of evidence that they wield is the fact that Philo of Alexandria never mentions Jesus in his writings. Now, if an esteemed historian like Philo, who lived at the same time as Jesus, never even mentioned the man, then clearly the only explanation is that Jesus never existed, and he was invented by the Christian church. The problem with Christian evidence is the same problem that will ruin baklava. No Philo. Oh, but no one will tell you about those facts. Christians ignore that fact. What's the matter, Christians? You don't like being disproven with logic? Is this argument too logical for you? Of course, the actual reason why this argument is ignored is because it is trash. Kind of like the whole Jesus mythicist movement. No serious historian accepts the conclusions of this school. So they want to be taken seriously, but they just aren't. And with my luck, they're probably going to find this video and leave lots of angry comments, but no amount of angry commenting is going to make them right. So why am I even giving them the time of day? Well, partly because it's fun to soapbox. Also, because it gives me the chance to point out several common misconceptions about ancient history and religion, and that is part of the mission of this show. But mostly, I am talking about them because it gives me the chance to quote esteemed theologian and Jedi Grandmaster Luke Skywalker. So here it goes. Amazing. Every word of what they just said is wrong. First of all, Philo was not an esteemed historian. He was a theological and biblical scholar. Out of his dozens of surviving works, he wrote exactly 2 that you could consider historical if you squint. One of these works was an attack on the Roman governor of Egypt. Philo wanted to talk about this governor and why he, in the most rigorous and historical terms possible, sucked. Truly astounding that while criticizing a corrupt governor of Egypt, Philo didn't find time to mention a wandering Judean teacher and wonder worker who had been executed for sedition. His other historical work was an account of his dealings with Caligula, and Caligula's whole put a giant statue of me in the temple project. Caligula didn't become emperor until 37 AD, by which point Jesus was, rather famously, dead. Or, had been dead, at least, and was back alive again, but he only really stuck around for like 40 days after the resurrection, so he wasn't on Earth. He'd vamosed out of there in his awesome cloud of glory, and hence was no longer a subject for secular historians. Long story short, there is absolutely no reason we should expect Philo to have mentioned Jesus in his scant historical writings. Second, even if Philo didn't mention the historical Jesus, the timeline proposed by the Jesus mythicists just doesn't add up. The argument only works if you assume that Philo could only have known Jesus if he was a real person and not a myth that had already been made up and was circulating. Now, Philo died in 50 AD. St. Paul was converted to the faith in the mid-30s AD and was already writing letters to churches by 48 AD. Philo could easily have known about Christian churches who, were already worshiping Christ. So either they were worshiping a real historical person, or the church managed to concoct the myth of a person within 15 years of his putative death, when most of the people who were named as eyewitnesses in the story were still alive. That is unlikely, to say the least. Third, there are other historians of the period who do mention Jesus. Well, really, we only have one historian in the period, the Jewish historian Josephus. He does mention Jesus and his followers, but that doesn't count for the Jesus mythicists because... reasons? I honestly don't know. So all those are good reasons not to buy the argument that Philo's silence is proof of the Christ myth theory. But there is another reason, and this is the one that really gets me. Because when I looked on the internet, as I really shouldn't, but do, alas, all too often, I noticed many Christians in the comments fighting back against this argument as if their faith depended on it. Now, as is often the case, the most dangerous ideas are not the ones we argue about. They're the ones we assume without question. And the one big idea that everybody seemed to agree on was this: that if Jesus really existed, he would have been a big enough deal by then that Philo would obviously have known about him. This is just not true. There is a tendency among Christians to assume that because Jesus is a big deal to us, he must be a big deal to everyone else. And that is just not the case. Look at this from an outsider's perspective. Jesus was a charismatic teacher and miracle worker who ministered for about 3 years, was killed by the Roman government, and was worshipped by a small but fervent band of his closest friends afterwards. Most parts of that story were not all that uncommon in first century Judea. There were lots of people who did miracles. There were lots of charismatic teachers. And if you're thinking, oh, Ben, what are you talking about? I've never heard of another charismatic teacher. Yeah, you have. All the Pharisees that Jesus was arguing with. They were also charismatic teachers. They were making the same rounds that Jesus was. Now, it's true that Jesus caused a big stir in Jerusalem for about a week, according to the Gospels. In John's Gospel, the Pharisees even say that the whole world had gone after him. But that was 1 week. And, as Holy Week makes very clear, by the end of that week, the crowd's opinion of Jesus had shifted. In a land that was hungry for a Messiah to lead it to independence, those kinds of flash-in-the-pan political sensations were not unheard of. I mean, think about how many candidates for president or prime minister last for a week or so before they collapse. And while early Christians were fervent believers, there were not all that many of them. So many outsiders saw the Christians as a weird nuisance, a cult barely worthy of mention. Now, it is true that the apostles occasionally managed to freak people out. The book of Acts records Paul's singular talent for getting kicked out of multiple cities due to his preaching. It turns out that if you can convince a few wealthy people to worship one god and no others, they stop buying idols. When they stop buying idols, the metal workers and craftsmen who make those idols get really mad that you just poached their biggest customers. But those workers were angry because their economic standing had been upset. That does not mean they considered Christianity a viable or even particularly noteworthy religion. It's kind of like when we learn that some wealthy celebrity has given millions of dollars to the Church of Scientology. It may ruffle feathers, but it doesn't mean that most people take Scientology any more seriously. And like it or not, that's how most Romans saw Christianity in its early days, as a fringe cult whose members were more to be pitied than feared. It's very hard to remember that now that Christianity is the world's largest religion and its adherents number in the billions. And for Christians, especially passionate Christians, it's hard not to believe that Christianity was always seen as an extraordinary, world-bending force. But the cost of looking at history with rose-tinted glasses is high. If we are ever going to be able to tell the story of the past right, we need to have empathy. We need to be able to set aside our beliefs and attitudes and attempt as best we can to see the past through the eyes of the people who lived in it. Sometimes that means facing truths that are painful to us. Like that a Jew like Philo probably did not think Jesus was worth mentioning if he even knew him at all. At the same time, that realization also opens up new possibilities for the Christian. Because after all, Jesus chose to live a life of relative obscurity. He was born in humble circumstances, spent most of his years toiling as a carpenter in a backwater province of Judea, and died an ignominious death. If one believes that God was incarnate in this Jesus, was reconciling the world in this obscure life, then why should faith in him not begin in obscurity, disrepute, and struggle? After all, it would be the pattern Christ himself set. Perhaps the biggest problem in this argument is not the historical truth of it at all. Perhaps it is the ever-present temptation of Christians to associate God with power, fame, and glory, rather than with the servanthood, humility, and obscurity that God took on in Christ. The latter might be a more fitting tribute to the faith of Christ, a faith that happened to be carried into Africa by a nameless Ethiopian eunuch who promptly vanished from the pages of history. Maybe humility is the truest way to follow along in Simeon's wake. Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.